So more commentary on the mind. Where does the mind come from? Is the mind just the brain? So this is on page 75. So he's quoting a Penfield in the book, The Mystery of the Mind. I guess he's some kind of neurologist, world-famous neurologist and brain surgeon. But just keep in mind, I think this was the late 80s, right? So this book, The Mystery of the Mind, is probably in the 80s somewhere. So we may know more now. But this is what Penfield says. Do brain mechanisms account for the mind? Can the mind be explained by what is now known about the brain? If not, which is the more reasonable of the two possible hypotheses? That man's being is based on one element or on two? And then Penfield goes on to say he comes to the conclusion that the mind seems to act independently of the brain in the sense that a programmer acts independently of his computer, however much he may depend upon the action of that computer for certain purposes. And then he says a bit more. There's a paragraph here, but this one line I think is good. He says that a computer must be operated by an agency capable of independent understanding. And obviously the programmer is higher than the computer, just as what I have called self-awareness is higher than consciousness. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, especially when he says that in terms of our soul, right? Like not a literal soul, not the religious soul, but perhaps the soul is this electric field created by our neurons in the brain, right? But again, it always comes back to the question, okay, what if it's just electrons, and why isn't it mechanical? And the metaphor being used here now is that, well, the programmer needs the computer, and the programmer knows the language, and the language can only be encoded in the computer, but still the programmer is something separate than the computer. It's not just a computer. And he says the brain or the computer is not an agency capable of independent understanding. Could a brain understand itself? Well, presumably not. So there must be something else. It can't just be a brain. It must be some electric field or whatever. And then he makes an interesting point on 76. He says that the author says his requirement is not simply knowledge of facts and theories, but understanding or insight. Not surprisingly, the processes of gaining insight are quite different from those of gaining factual knowledge. So yes, a computer could gain factual knowledge. It can do data searches and all of that. It can find keywords. And just like on Jeopardy, they had a supercomputer that was able to answer Jeopardy questions, at least most of the time. But could a Jeopardy supercomputer gain insight? I don't think so. Like, that's the crucial thing. So why are we able to become wise and a computer cannot? So that's another crucial question. If it's purely mechanical, if the mind is purely mechanical, then we can make an artificial mind. We would have to be able to. It must be possible. But I guess so far, our computers have not been able to simulate human thinking and human behavior. So a Data, like from Star Trek, is not yet possible. And the interesting thing about Data, which is an android on the TV show Star Trek, The Next Generation with Captain Picard and all that. The interesting thing about all of that, and I really like the show, it's very well done, is that Data is trying to be human, and his actions are very human-like. He's a very sophisticated, and yet supposedly he's running on programs. And he even has the ability to make new programs. Like, for example, one of the episodes, he dates some engineer on the ship, and he makes a new program that would then try to court her, kind of thing. A new program, which is kind of an interesting way of how a human might do it. So you're dating someone, you're kind of thinking about how you're going to approach that dating. And that's the same thing how Data the robot, or Data the android, I mean, does that as well. And they add that character in that TV show they did a very good job of kind of simulating how humans do certain things and how an android would have basically approximate it, right? But yet still, you still can see that Data is running on a program. So anyways, so the interesting ideas there about, well, is the mind specifically the brain? Well, it seems like it cannot be because of our powers and abilities. But if we were to be able to make an artificial intelligence that could do everything a human could do, then of course you could say, well, then this must be material.